Men on this Roman warship are carrying the wrong weapons. Look at them. They have shields designed for standing in tight formation on flat ground. They have short swords meant for close-range infantry fighting. They have armor shaped for a man who plants his feet and holds a line. The sea is moving beneath the hull. The planking is still green. This ship was cut from Italian forests less than 2 months ago. Half the men rowing in the hold have never been on open water before this week. None of that is the strangest thing about this moment. The strangest thing is the structure mounted at the ship's prow. A heavy wooden bridge, roughly 11 meters long and just wide enough for 2 men to walk abreast, attached to a vertical pole by a system of ropes and pulleys. It is cranked upward at an angle, under tension, held in place by a single line. At its far end, hanging down from the underside, is an iron spike, not decorative, heavy, industrial, shaped deliberately like the beak of a bird. The sea off northern Sicily in 260 BC smells of pine resin and salt water. There is the rhythmic sound of oars being pulled. The Carthaginian fleet is perhaps 40 meters away. Those Carthaginian commanders have every reason to feel confident. Their sailors have spent their entire lives at sea. Their officers understand wind, tide, current, and ramming angles, the way Roman centurions understand formation, spacing, and shield angles. Carthage has been the dominant naval power in the Western Mediterranean for centuries. Rome, by contrast, built this fleet less than 2 months ago. The men rowing below deck practiced that skill on wooden benches in Italian fields, while these ships were still timber in a forest. The Carthaginians do not know what the structure at the Roman prow is. No one does. It has never been deployed in combat before. The line releases. The bridge swings out over the water. The spike drops. Iron drives through the deck of the nearest Carthaginian ship with a sound that no sailor present has heard in their career. The spike bites in, locks. 2 warships, one Roman, one Carthaginian, are now fastened together on open water, grinding against each other, neither able to pull free quickly. And before the Carthaginian crew can organize a response, the soldiers come across that bridge. Not sailors, soldiers. What follows is not a naval engagement in any sense the ancient world has seen before. It is a land battle happening on water, between a Carthaginian crew that cannot use its seamanship and a Roman infantry force that is, at this moment, fighting on the only kind of terrain it fully understands. Most people know Rome for its legions, for its roads and its law and the engineering of its aqueducts and the durability of its political structures. What almost nobody stops to ask is how a civilization that had no warships at all in the early 3rd century BC became the power that turned the Mediterranean into a Roman administrative space, and what that process cost, and what it created, and why the word every speaker in the world uses today for the platform they address, an audience from traces directly to the killing iron at the end of that wooden bridge. That story is not a simple one. It contains some of the worst military disasters in ancient history. It contains genuine institutional genius and extraordinary incompetence, often from the same side. It runs across 2 centuries and 3 phases of Roman power. And it begins not with a victory, but with a problem Rome could not solve any other way. Sicily was the problem. By 264 BC, Rome had spent over a century unifying peninsular Italy through a combination of military force, carefully managed alliances, and the kind of disciplined stubbornness that had proven itself the most reliable weapon Rome possessed. Its armies were very good. Its political system was robust enough to survive serious defeats and keep producing capable leaders. As a land power, the Roman Republic had become, by the early 3rd century, the most formidable state in the Italian world. The sea was an entirely different question. When Rome first needed to move troops across the Strait of Messina to intervene in a Sicilian dispute in 264 BC, it had no warships of its own. It borrowed quinqueremes and triremes from the Greek cities of southern Italy, from Tarentum, from Locri, from Elea and Neapolis, because there was nothing in the Roman arsenal capable of making that crossing under threat. The Romans had signed multiple treaties with Carthage over the previous 2 centuries that had, in their broad structure, acknowledged a natural division. Rome was the land power of Italy, and Carthage was the maritime power of the Western Mediterranean. That arrangement had worked because neither power had yet been forced to contest the other's primary domain. Carthage, the great city-state on the North African coast, had been building its maritime tradition for centuries. Its sailors were recruited from Phoenician coastal communities and trained from early life in the skills that ancient naval warfare demanded: reading weather, timing, a ramming approach, managing hundreds of oars in tight coordination, maintaining ship speed under the stress of combat. Carthaginian officers understood the Western Mediterranean's currents, seasonal winds, and harbor approaches the way Roman officers understood Italian terrain. The professional quality of Carthaginian crews was, at that point in history, simply the standard against which other navies were measured. The structural problem became clear to Rome within the first years of fighting on Sicily. Roman armies could defeat Carthaginian forces in land engagements. They did, repeatedly. They captured cities, they pushed back Carthaginian garrisons, and none of it was enough, because Carthaginian ships controlled the sea around the island. Those ships could move supplies and reinforcements freely. They could harass Roman coastal positions. They could cut Roman supply lines from Italy whenever it was strategically useful. Roman soldiers who won a battle in the morning could find their supply convoys destroyed by evening. The island was a trap for any army that could not control the water surrounding it. Rome had no answer for this. The allied Greek fleets it had borrowed were adequate for moving troops in calm water. They were not capable of sustained combat against Carthaginian warships at sea. The war in Sicily was going to stay a war in Sicily until one side found a way to change the equation at sea. Then a Carthaginian quinquerem ran aground on the Sicilian coast. The Romans captured it, and according to the Greek historian Polybius, who wrote about these events roughly a century after they occurred and had access to earlier written accounts, what happened next was one of the most audacious acts of military engineering in the ancient record. Roman shipbuilders, who had no familiarity with vessels of this type, because no one in Italy had built quinqueremes before, studied the captured hull. They measured it. They took it apart in their minds. They reverse-engineered its proportions and its structure. And then the Senate ordered 100 vessels like it built in 60 days, along with 20 smaller triremes. Whether the 60-day figure is precise is something historians reasonably question, Polybius wrote, long after the fact. And stories about Rome's institutional speed tend to harden into legend. But something extraordinary clearly happened in those months, because Rome went from having no serious war fleet to deploying one at scale in a time frame that still impresses military historians who study ancient logistics. Polybius himself could not quite believe it. He wrote that the Romans undertook the endeavor with such extraordinary audacity that, without any preliminary experience, they committed themselves to meeting the Carthaginians on a sea those Carthaginians had controlled, unchallenged for generations. The ships were being built in forests and shipyards across Italy. That left the question of who was going to row them. Polybius records that Rome solved this problem in a way that is, once you picture it clearly, one of the stranger images in ancient military history. The Romans built tiered wooden frames on land benches arranged to replicate the rowing configuration of a quinquereme's oar banks and set thousands of men on those frames to practice synchronized rowing. In Italian fields, on dry ground, no water, no rocking, no horizon. A drum set the cadence. The men pulled wooden handles in unison while the ships they were being trained to crew were still being assembled nearby. It was not elegant. It was not the solution of a civilization with centuries of maritime instinct behind it. It was the solution of a civilization that believed any physical skill, properly systematized and drilled, could be transferred from one domain to another. Rome could not give its rowers decades of experience. It could give them synchronization, repetition, and discipline, which were precisely the things Rome already understood better than almost anyone. What it could not give them was the ability to outmaneuver Carthaginian sailors who had been at sea since childhood. And Rome knew this. So Rome built something else. Its name in later sources is the corvus, the raven. Whether that was actually what Romans called the device at the time is uncertain. Some historians believe the ancient term may have been different, with corvus being a label applied later to a description that survived. But Polybius describes its mechanics in specific detail, and his description is careful enough to suggest he was working from good sources. A wooden bridge approximately 11 meters long and just over a meter wide, with a low fence-like parapet running along each side to keep soldiers from stepping off the edge. Mounted at the prow of a quinquereme on a vertical wooden pole, held upward at an angle by a rope and pulley arrangement that allowed it to be raised, swung in any direction, and released. At its outer end, on the underside, hung the iron spike. When the bridge was raised and pivoted over an enemy vessel and the rope released, the spike drove down through that ship's deck under the full weight of the falling structure. The spike bit into the wood and locked there. Two ships were now fastened together, grinding against each other on open water, unable to separate without tearing the spike free, which neither crew could accomplish quickly in the chaos of an engagement. And once the ships were locked, the boarding bridge was a road. Roman soldiers in full infantry armor could walk across that bridge, 2 men wide, shields raised, moving toward an enemy crew that was suddenly fighting a very different battle than the one they had prepared for. The nautical variables wind angle, rowing speed, ramming approach, the ability to back oars and create distance were suddenly irrelevant. What mattered was what happened when 2 groups of men in armor got close to each other, and on that question, Roman training had produced very clear answers for a very long time. This was not an accident. This was a philosophical position expressed in hardware. Rome could not teach seamanship in 60 days. It could teach soldiers to use a bridge, so it built a bridge, mounted it on the front of every warship it had, and turned the contest from one about seamanship into one about infantry discipline. The sea had been a Carthaginian advantage. The corvus removed it. The first test came in 260 BC, off the northern coast of Sicily near the town of Mylae. The Carthaginian commander was an officer named Hannibal Gisco. His fleet numbered approximately 130 ships. The Roman fleet, under the consul Gaius Duilius, a man whose entire military career to this point had been on land, had somewhere around 143, though the precise number is uncertain because Rome had lost 17 ships in an embarrassing earlier encounter at the Lipari Islands, where the senior consul had rowed directly into a Carthaginian ambush while attempting to negotiate. The Carthaginians approached Mylae with confidence. They had every reason to. The Roman fleet was crewed by soldiers and field-trained rowers, led by a land general. The only variable no one on the Carthaginian side had calculated correctly was the structure at each Roman ship's prow. The first Carthaginian ships to close on the Roman line were seized before their crews fully understood the mechanism. The bridge swung, the spike fell, the ships locked, Roman soldiers crossed and fought hand-to-hand on Carthaginian decks. Then more Carthaginian ships came in, tried to approach from different angles to avoid the device. The corvus pivoted to meet them. Polybius describes it swinging to engage ships approaching from the side or even the rear. The Carthaginian flagship itself was locked and boarded. Its commander, Hannibal Gisco, escaped his own ship on a small rowboat, the admiral of the finest naval force in the western Mediterranean, abandoning his flagship to men who had learned to row in a field. When the surviving Carthaginian ships broke off and fled, Rome had taken or destroyed approximately 50 of them. The precise loss figures vary between ancient sources, but what seems clear is that the battle was not close. Gaius Duilius returned to Rome and received the first naval triumph in Roman history. A column was erected in the Roman Forum in his honor, the Columna Rostrata, the Rostra column, its shaft decorated with the bronze prows of captured Carthaginian warships. And in doing so, Duilius established a tradition that Rome would maintain for centuries. When you won at sea, you brought the prows back to the center of Roman civic life and put them where senators, citizens, merchants, and foreign delegations could see them every day. The device had worked. The doctrine was validated. Rome pressed forward. The victories came in sequence over the following years. Rome won at Sardinia, won at Tyndaris, won again and again using the same logic: find the enemy fleet, lock ships together, let the soldiers do their work. Each victory increased Roman confidence, and Roman confidence had a way of eventually outrunning Roman judgment. By 256 BC, the Senate decided that the war could be ended by going directly at Carthage itself, not fighting in Sicily, not blocking supply routes, sailing to North Africa and threatening the city at its source. To carry that invasion force, Rome assembled a fleet whose scale ancient sources struggle to describe adequately. The two consuls commanding it, Marcus Atilius Regulus and Lucius Manlius Vulso, had 330 quinqueremes. Carthage mobilized 350 to stop them. The two fleets met off the southern coast of Sicily, near a promontory called Cape Ecnomus, in a battle that modern military historians consider a strong candidate for the largest naval engagement in ancient history by total number of combatants. Polybius gives the Roman fleet approximately 140,000 men, sailors, marines, and soldiers combined, and the Carthaginian force comparable numbers. Even applying the skepticism that ancient casualty figures deserve, the scale of what assembled off that Sicilian headland was something the ancient world had never quite seen before. Rome won. The Carthaginian fleet broke off. The invasion force landed in North Africa. Regulus pushed toward Carthage, winning early engagements and advancing far enough to open peace negotiations. The terms he reportedly demanded were so severe that Carthage refused them and kept fighting. Carthage then brought in a Spartan mercenary general named Xanthippus, who reorganized their army using combined arms, elephants, cavalry, and disciplined infantry, working together in a way that Regulus's force was not prepared to counter. At the Battle of the Bagradas River, the Roman army in North Africa was destroyed. Regulus was captured. The Africa campaign was over. Rome dispatched a rescue fleet to bring home the survivors. What happened next is described by Polybius as the greatest maritime catastrophe he knew of in the ancient record. The rescue fleet first fought a successful naval engagement off the North African coast. It collected the surviving soldiers and turned north. The fleet's experienced captains, the men who actually understood these waters, advised against sailing along the southern coast of Sicily. The season was wrong. It was midsummer, the period when Mediterranean storms came quickly and the Sicilian coastline offered almost nowhere to shelter. The consuls overruled them. Off the town of Camarina, a violent summer storm struck the fleet in the darkness. Ancient sources give the losses as 384 ships out of a total of 464. The human toll, by ancient reckoning, was somewhere near 100,000 dead sailors, soldiers, marines, the very men who had just been rescued from North Africa. Probably the largest single death event of the entire war, and it was caused not by Carthage but by a decision to sail a coast that the fleet's own captains had judged too dangerous to approach. Around 80 ships managed to reach the port of Syracuse. The rest left wreckage along miles of Sicilian coastline. The Senate ordered a new fleet built. Within 2 years, a reconstructed Roman navy was operating again. It conducted raids along the North African coast. On the return voyage, sailing near Cape Palinurus on the Italian coast, another storm struck. Ancient sources record approximately 150 more ships lost. The Senate ordered another fleet built. The pattern was becoming something almost incomprehensible in terms of scale. Rome had now absorbed 2 catastrophic storm losses, with combined casualties that exceeded the toll of many ancient land campaigns. It had maintained armies in Sicily for a decade, at enormous cost. And it had done all of this for a war that was still not won. The low point came in 249 BC. The consul commanding Rome's navy that year was Publius Claudius Pulcher. He planned a surprise night attack on the Carthaginian fleet anchored at the harbour of Drepana on Sicily's western coast. The logic was sound enough: in outline strike before dawn, before the enemy can respond, and destroy them at anchor. The execution required precision, and precision was exactly what Pulcher did not achieve. The Roman fleet rode through the darkness in column and arrived off Drepana in disorder. The lead ships had crowded together. The column was compressed and confused. The Carthaginian commander, Adherbal, realized the attack was coming in time to move his ships out of the harbor into open water before the trap could close. The Roman fleet, entering a constricted space in the wrong formation, found the Carthaginian ships already positioned to engage them on unfavorable terms. Rome lost 93 ships captured. An unknown number were sunk. The casualties, by ancient accounts, ran to approximately 20,000 men killed or taken prisoner. Adherbal's fleet did not lose a single ship. Roman writers, working long after the fact, attached a story to this disaster that survived because it felt true to how Rome processed military failure. They said that before the attack, Pulcher had consulted the sacred chickens that commanders carried aboard their ships for divining omens. The chickens refused to eat, a sign the gods disapproved of the day's action. Pulcher, according to these later accounts, threw the chickens into the sea, saying that if they would not eat, they could drink. Polybius, writing closer to the events, does not record this story. It appears in writers like Cicero and Valerius Maximus, working centuries later. Whether it happened, the story survived because Romans needed a way to name what a commander who ignored every warning looked like. The man who drowned the sacred chickens became a symbol for a kind of arrogance that the sea punishes. The punishment was not finished. Shortly after Drepana, the remainder of Rome's available fleet was destroyed in yet another storm near the same Sicilian coastline that had claimed the fleet of 255 BC. The Senate appointed a dictator. Roman naval operations effectively ceased. 3 catastrophic storm losses, one of the worst defeats in open battle Rome had suffered at sea. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of trained men, 7 years of silence on the water. The question sitting at the center of 242 BC was whether Rome would ever put another fleet in those waters again. The Roman state, by that point, was financially exhausted. 23 years of continuous war had emptied the treasury in ways that made another government-funded shipbuilding program an impossibility. The Senate faced a problem with no institutional solution. The war in Sicily could not be won without control of the sea, and control of the sea required ships that the state could not afford to build. What happened next is genuinely unusual in ancient military history and deserves more attention than it typically receives. Wealthy Roman citizens stepped forward and personally financed a new fleet, not as a gift, as loans. Individuals and small syndicates, senators, merchants, landowners, men of the equestrian class, put their own money behind the construction of 200 new quinqueremes, with the formal understanding that they would be repaid from whatever financial settlement Carthage was forced to accept when the war ended. They were betting on the outcome. Private capital backing a public war because the state that was fighting it had run out of the capacity to fund itself. The new ships were built from the template of a fast warship Rome had recently captured, possibly reflecting a shift in tactics. The corvus, so decisive in 260 BC, seems to have been quietly set aside. There is no record of it being used after the Battle of Ecnomus. The final Roman fleet of the First Punic War appears to have been built for speed and ramming capability, rather than for the boarding first doctrine that had defined the war's early years. The crews who manned it were not the anxious novices of 260 BC. They were the veterans of 2 decades of Sicilian operations men who had survived storms and sieges and the grinding attrition of a conflict that had outlasted most of the people who started it. The consul Gaius Lutatius Catulus used this fleet to blockade Carthage's last 2 major Sicilian strongholds, Drepana and Lilybaeum. Cut off from resupply, the Carthaginian garrisons could hold their walls indefinitely, but they could not hold them forever. Carthage assembled a relief fleet and sent it north. On the morning of March 10, 241 BC, Catulus moved to intercept that fleet near a cluster of small islands off Sicily's western tip called the Agates, the Goat Islands. The tactical situation had almost perfectly reversed the conditions of Drepana 12 years earlier. This time it was the Carthaginian ships that were heavy and encumbered, loaded with supplies and troops for the Sicilian garrisons, crewed by men who had been hastily assembled and inadequately trained. The Romans were lean, prepared, and sailing with an experienced wind at their backs. The battle was not prolonged. Ancient sources give the Carthaginian losses as approximately 50 ships sunk and 70 captured. The relief force never reached the garrisons it was sent to save. Hamilcar Barca, fighting an undefeated guerrilla campaign in the Sicilian hills, having never lost a land engagement he controlled, received orders from Carthage to negotiate terms. The sea had been taken from him. The garrisons could not be fed. His army could not be reinforced. He had won every battle available to him and lost the war anyway, because the war was ultimately decided on water. The Treaty of Lutatius ended the First Punic War. Carthage surrendered Sicily and agreed to a substantial indemnity in silver over the following decade. 23 years of continuous conflict, at a cost that Polybius described as higher than any war he knew of in the ancient record. Rome's first province. The ships and sailors and soldiers who had made this possible are mostly nameless in the historical record, but some of what they touched is still physically present. Since 2005, archaeological teams from the Soprintendenza del Mare in Sicily and the RPM Nautical Foundation have been systematically surveying the seafloor near the Egadi Islands at the site of the final battle. They have recovered 25 bronze warship rams from that seabed, the only ancient naval battlefield ever positively identified through underwater archaeology. Some of the rams carry inscriptions in Latin, some in Punic. They have been lying there since March 241 BC, in water where the battle ended before the last survivors had finished climbing ashore. The First Punic War, in those rams, is not ancient, it is present. If the depth of this history, the scale of what Rome built and lost and rebuilt, the way military institutions actually form under pressure, is something you want more of, this channel makes exactly these kinds of videos. There's a subscribe button there, and it means you'll know when the next one arrives. What happened in the decades after Carthage surrendered is the part of this story that most tellings either skip or compress too quickly. The war ended. Rome controlled Sicily. The Western Mediterranean was, in the broadest political sense, a Roman space. And Rome, having spent 23 years and an incalculable number of human lives building a navy, allowed that navy to contract. Not immediately, not all at once, but steadily, over the following century and a half, as Rome's wars shifted east and the Second Punic War proved to be primarily a land conflict. The institutional capacity that had been built so expensively during the First Punic War simply leaked away. There was no permanent professional fleet. Ships were built for specific campaigns and then allowed to decay. Experienced crews dispersed, officers moved on to land commands that carried more prestige. The knowledge accumulated through catastrophe and rebuilding was not stored in an institution. It was stored in people, and people eventually retired, or died, or were transferred to somewhere the Senate considered more pressing. Into that vacuum, piracy expanded. The criminal networks operating primarily from the southern coast of what is now Turkey, a region the Romans called Cilicia, were not petty criminals. They ran organized fleets with their own commanders, their own bases, their own supply chains and financial networks. The chaos generated by Rome's wars in the eastern Mediterranean had given them space to grow. By the 70s BC, they were operating at a scale that Rome could no longer ignore, attacking grain ships, disrupting the supply routes on which the city's population depended, kidnapping Roman citizens, including magistrates with official status, and even raiding Ostia itself, Rome's own harbour, positioned at the mouth of the Tiber, close enough that the smoke would have been visible from the city walls. Grain prices in Rome spiked. The city's roughly 1 million inhabitants faced genuine food insecurity because the sea lanes had been abandoned. The political consequences were immediate and serious. There had been earlier attempts at suppression, a campaign here, a squadron sent there, but none had been organized at the scale the problem required. What was needed was not a punitive expedition. What was needed was a comprehensive naval operation covering the entire Mediterranean simultaneously. The Senate was deeply reluctant to authorize what that actually meant in practice. In early 67 BC, a tribune of the people named Aulus Gabinius proposed the Lex Gabinia, a law granting a single Roman general complete proconsular authority over the entire Mediterranean Sea and all land within roughly 50 miles of its coastline, for a period of 3 years, with resources to match: 500 ships, 120,000 soldiers, 5,000 cavalry, and discretionary access to public funds. Everyone understood who would receive this command. Gnaeus Pompeius, Magnus Pompey the Great, was the most successful general of his generation and the most politically potent private citizen in Rome. The Senate opposed the law almost unanimously. The popular assembly passed it anyway. Wheat prices in Rome reportedly fell the day the law was announced, which tells you how acutely ordinary Romans understood what the piracy crisis was costing them. Pompey accepted the command and immediately demonstrated what Roman logistical thinking looked like when given the resources to operate without constraint. He divided the Mediterranean into 13 simultaneous command zones. Each zone was assigned its own squadron, its own commander, and its own operational brief. The strategy was designed to function like a net rather than a spear, not to pursue pirates fleet by fleet, but to deny them the ability to relocate when pressure arrived. The western Mediterranean, Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, the North African coast, was cleared in approximately 40 days. 40 days. The pirate fleets retreated east. The net followed them. Pompey had deliberately left one zone, Cilicia, the pirates' primary base, as the trap at the end of the funnel, where a coordinated land and sea assault was waiting. A final naval engagement in the Bay of Coracesium, followed by an offer of clemency and resettlement rather than slaughter, and the campaign was effectively complete in less than 3 months of actual operations. Cicero wrote of this campaign that never had so much power been given to any one man. He was correct, and that observation contained the flaw in the solution that Cicero either did not see or chose not to name. Pompey's campaign worked because of Pompey, because of his particular organizational mind, because of his authority to act simultaneously across every provincial boundary in the Mediterranean world, because of his political position, which made it possible to raise and deploy resources at a scale that no ordinary proconsul could have assembled. When the campaign ended, the problem was solved, but only because Pompey had personally solved it. The institutional structure that would have maintained the solution did not exist. The navy that had won was not permanent. The 13-zone command structure dissolved when the campaign ended. What Rome had built in 40 days was a temporary answer to a problem that required a permanent one. The permanent answer was still 36 years away. It was going to require one more war, and an admiral whose name was not quite as famous as the others, and a device that would have been familiar to the soldiers who had crossed a boarding bridge at Mylae 2 centuries earlier. Marcus Agrippa was the kind of military figure that history tends to undervalue relative to the commanders he served. Technically gifted, operationally brilliant, not especially interested in the kind of self-promotion that generates famous anecdotes. He was Octavian's closest general, the man responsible for the actual mechanics of military victory in the civil wars that followed Julius Caesar's assassination. And in the years leading up to 31 BC, as the conflict between Octavian and Mark Antony became the conflict that would determine who controlled Rome, it was Agrippa who understood that the war would ultimately be decided at sea. Antony had built a large fleet. Many of his ships were heavy quinqueremes, the same class of warship that had defined Mediterranean naval combat for 2.5 centuries. His strategy, in the broadest terms, relied on the size and firepower of those vessels. Heavy ships with thick hulls and strong rams, crewed by experienced sailors, could theoretically overwhelm a numerically superior but less powerful enemy fleet through sheer mass. Antony was confident in his ships. Agrippa made different choices. He built smaller, faster. He equipped Octavian's fleet primarily with Liburnian's lighter warships based on an Illyrian design, lower in the water, quicker to maneuver, more responsive in the confined, choppy conditions of a fleet engagement. He also brought to Actium a weapon he had already proven effective at an earlier engagement called Naulicus in 36 BC, where he had used it against Sextus Pompey's fleet. The device was called the Harpax. The Harpax was a heavy iron grapple, launched from a large shipboard ballista, essentially a torsion artillery piece capable of striking an enemy vessel from a distance and then being winched in, pulling the two ships together, regardless of whether the target wanted to close. Once the grapple caught in an enemy ship's structure, oarsmen pulling in opposite directions only drove the hook deeper. The ship was coming, whether its crew wanted it to or not. Recognize the logic. 229 years separated the corvus at Mylae from the Harpax at Actium. The mechanisms were different. One dropped from above, the other flew across the water and caught from a distance, but the doctrine was identical. When you cannot outmaneuver a more experienced fleet, change what the fight is about. Lock ships together. Eliminate the variables of seamanship and speed. Let your soldiers do what your soldiers do. The battle itself took place on September 2, 31 BC, in the waters off the promontory of Actium on the western Greek coast. Antony's position had already been weakened before the fleets engaged. His camp had spent months in an unhealthy location near the water. Disease and malnutrition had cost him a significant portion of his fleet's crews by some accounts. A third of his manpower was gone before a single oar was pulled in anger. Agrippa had been systematically cutting his supply routes for months, ensuring that the engagement, when it finally came, would be fought by a hungry, understaffed force against a prepared one. When the fleets engaged, Antony's heavy quinqueremes struggled to bring their mass to bear against Agrippa's faster, more maneuverable Liburnians. The lighter ships moved around them, struck and withdrew before the larger vessels could build up ramming speed, then struck again from a different angle. The Harpax launched from ballistas, reaching across the water and catching in enemy hulls and oars, drawing the great heavy ships into range, where smaller crews could board them and fight hand to hand. Ancient sources describe Antony's largest ships becoming, in effect, floating fortresses capable of hurling stones and firing arrows, but unable to move effectively, unable to close with an enemy that refused to stay in front of them. At some point during the battle, Cleopatra's squadron, the Egyptian ships that had been positioned at the rear of Antony's fleet, carrying her treasure, broke off and sailed south. Antony followed. He left his fleet without its commander, in the middle of an engagement, to follow a woman and her treasure ships toward Egypt. The remaining fleet, leaderless and already under severe pressure, disintegrated. Some ships surrendered. Some were burned. Octavian's forces controlled the sea. The civil wars were over. Octavian would become Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, and in that transformation the Mediterranean would enter a period of unified political control that had no real historical precedent. But what made that control durable, what made the Pax Romana possible on the water as well as the land, was not the victory at Actium. It was what Augustus built in the years immediately after. In 27 BC, Augustus founded two permanent professional naval fleets. The Classis Missinensis was based at the harbour complex Agrippa had developed at Misenum on the Bay of Naples, a purpose-built naval installation with docks, warehouses, training facilities, and a canal connecting the port to an inland lake where new crews could practice in calm water. This fleet commanded the western Mediterranean. It was designated Praetoria, the fleet that served directly under the emperor's authority, the naval equivalent of the Praetorian Guard, the senior fleet of the Imperial Roman Navy. The Classis Ravennas was based at a new harbour complex near Ravenna on the Adriatic coast, at a port called Classe, a word that simply meant fleet, which suggests something about how central this installation was to the local identity that formed around it. This fleet commanded the Adriatic and supported operations in the eastern Mediterranean. These were not forces assembled for a crisis. They were standing institutions with permanent bases, permanent infrastructure, permanent career structures, and permanent personnel rosters. Service in the Imperial Navy ran 26 years longer than even the Army's auxiliary units demanded. Men who completed that term received Roman citizenship, which tells you something essential about who was actually serving. In the early imperial period, the Navy recruited heavily from the eastern Mediterranean, from Egypt, from coastal provincial communities where seafaring was part of daily life. The fleet was, among other things, a decades-long path to citizenship for people who were not yet Roman citizens. Beyond Misenum and Ravenna, Rome maintained smaller flotillas across the empire's waterways, a fleet in the English Channel, river squadrons on the Rhine and the Danube, detachments in Egyptian waters and along the Syrian coast. The Mediterranean was no longer just patrolled, it was administered. The grain convoys from Egypt that fed Rome's population, the timber shipments that kept shipyards supplied, the tax revenues and official correspondence moving between provinces, all of it travelled on water that now had a permanent Roman naval presence watching over it. The name Rome had given that sea, by this point, Mare Nostrum. Our sea was no longer an aspiration, it was a description. The institution Augustus built in 27 BC would persist in various forms for centuries. The harbour at Classe near Ravenna was large enough to shelter 250 ships and generated a city around it that still exists today. Gravestones of sailors who served in those fleets have been found across the Mediterranean world, marking lives that were spent in the permanent professional navy that Rome had finally, after 2 centuries of building and losing and rebuilding, gotten around to creating. The full arc of this story runs from 264 BC to 27 BC, roughly 240 years, measured from the moment Rome first needed to cross the Strait of Messina in borrowed ships to the moment Augustus permanently institutionalized the fleet that would maintain Roman sea power for generations. In between, a fleet built in 60 days from the hull of a captured enemy warship, a device that turned sea battles into infantry engagements by locking 2 ships together with an iron spike, a storm that killed more people in a single night than most ancient battles, and a Senate that ordered a new fleet built anyway, a second storm that destroyed that fleet, and then a defeat at the hands of an actual enemy, and 7 years of silence while Rome decided whether the sea was worth the price. Private citizens putting their own money behind the final fleet when the state couldn't fund it anymore. A decisive battle decided not by superior seamanship, but by a well-prepared Roman force catching an encumbered, undertrained Carthaginian fleet in bad weather. Then the long years of neglect, the pirates, Pompey's extraordinary personal solution, and finally, Agrippa and Actium, where the same doctrinal logic that had produced the corvus 2 centuries earlier produced the harpax, and where Rome's final civil war was settled by an admiral who understood that soldiers crossing a bridge to an enemy deck and soldiers pulled alongside an enemy ship by a grappling hook are different mechanics, in service of the same idea. What Rome built was never a tradition in the way that Carthaginian seamanship was a tradition. Rome never produced sailors who stood alongside the Greek or Carthaginian seafarers of the ancient world in terms of raw nautical skill. What Rome built instead was a doctrine, a consistent philosophical position about how to make the sea fight on terms that Rome could control, and eventually, after enormous cost, a permanent institution to carry that doctrine forward. That institution did not survive the fall of the Western Empire in the 5th century AD, but something else did. After Mylae, in 260 BC, Gaius Duilius erected a column in the Roman Forum, decorated with the bronze prows of captured Carthaginian warships. He began a tradition that Rome maintained for centuries, taking the iron rams, the rostra, in Latin from ships taken in naval battle, and mounting them on public structures in Rome's civic center. The speaker's platform in the Roman Forum was decorated with such prows from as early as 338 BC, when a Roman general mounted 6 captured warship rams on its facade after a victory over the Latin fleet at Antium. From that point forward, the platform bore the name of what was attached to it, the rostra, named for the killing iron on the prow of a warship, named for the spike that drove into enemy decks and locked two ships together so soldiers could cross. Roman politicians addressed the Roman people for centuries from a platform that was simultaneously a monument to naval warfare, the place where laws were argued and decisions announced, and the Republic's political life conducted, all of it built around the hardware of sea combat. The word that described that hardware transferred to the structure it decorated, and the structure's name transferred to any platform used for public address. English inherited it, as it inherited much of Latin's military vocabulary. The word is still in use. Every graduation ceremony, every conference keynote, every courtroom address, every lecture hall, the platform the speaker stands on, carries a name that comes from the iron beak of an ancient warship in the 3rd century BC, rostrum. Its origin is not rhetorical, it is naval. That is what Rome built at sea, not a tradition of seamanship, not a culture of maritime exploration. What Rome built was a doctrine, an institution, and eventually a word now embedded in the languages of countries Rome never knew existed, used daily by people who have never thought about the Punic Wars and will never need to. The soldiers on that ship in 260 BC were carrying the wrong weapons for a naval engagement. The device above them had never been tested in combat. Their rowers had practiced their stroke in Italian fields. None of that should have been enough. But it was, and the word is still in your mouth.